tonight gets to finish our roots portion of our conversation, and that is from last week, church history, theology, and practice. Reserving about half of our time today for some thinking together about what is God, what's God up to in the world? What are the needs of the world? What are the urgent demands and needs in our community, in our region, in our nation, and the world? Again, we have no small topics here. I was trying to paint a complicated picture of Christian mission in the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's complicated because Christianity has always kind of piggybacked on the powers that be, and yet has also turned out to be somewhat an inconvenience to the powers that be. So my own experience as a missionary, I'd like to use that to make that point. So I mentioned how it was because of colonialism in the person of Cecil John Rhodes, particularly, that Christianity came to Zimbabwe.
What was the old name for Zimbabwe?
Southern Rhodesia. And then after Zambia got its independence, there was no more Northern Rhodesia, so Southern Rhodesia just became Rhodesia. So these are some of the first missionaries at the lower right-hand corner. The first missionaries were not just white Congregationalists from America. They were also Zulu missionaries, Zulu evangelists from South Africa and Mozambique that came up from south and also came west from Mozambique, or what was called the Portuguese East Africa. So our mission work, our congregational mission work in Zimbabwe was always multiracial, multicultural, multilingual. And interestingly, there were also some African Americans who were some of the early missionaries. So it was always kind of a multiracial effort, even from 1893, when the first missionaries arrived. So it's interesting that they piggybacked on a colonial racist ideology, but were themselves multiracial. So this is the sense in which Christian missions is always kind of a little bit, or a lot, subversive of the dominant order. Now, I'm going to mention that here a little bit more. I mentioned Mbuya Sukuta. She's somebody who witnessed it all, almost from the beginning. She was a little girl when the first missionaries were still there in Zimbabwe. She wrote this lovely book, I've got it here. She doesn't seem to be bothered by the fact that the missionaries piggybacked onto the colonial government. All she sees is development. She sees medical work, educational work, economic development work, extension of the lifespan, the promotion of equality between men and women. She sees all the good stuff. She didn't. And the whole 6 years I was in Zimbabwe, no one ever came to me and said, weren't those first missionaries just tools of the colonialists? Instead, they were always very grateful for the work of those early missionaries. Now, maybe they were just grateful because they were talking to a missionary. That's right. But it seemed genuine to me. Yes, that's me on the right. What's interesting to me is that even though Cecil Rhodes established these missions to kind of civilize the natives, 60 years later, it was the students at the mission schools who themselves joined the nationalist struggle against white minority rule, who went in Mozambique when Mozambique got its independence in 1975, joined the freedom struggle. Why? Because I think in part, not only was this their land, they wanted to fight for their land, but because I think the missionaries had taught them about equality. So in 1965, when the white minority regime of Ian Smith, these are maybe a name you even remember, declared unilateral independence from the United Kingdom, the white government came to the American missions, Methodist, Baptist, Congregational, and said, all American missionaries out. So all American missionaries were deported in 1965 because everybody knew they were teaching equality. They were teaching that the future of this country will be in the hands of the majority people. They were accused of teaching the students how to make Molotov cocktails. This was probably not true. I can't quite picture any congregational ministers from Connecticut during that. It was also just known that these missions, especially on the Mozambique border, were all sympathetic with the nationalist cause. Where did they get that idea? I think they got it in part from the missionaries' teachings about equality and about human dignity and about, which eventually leads to the idea of democracy, one person, one vote, which is a threat to a white minority regime. Whites were only about 5% of Zimbabwe, but they controlled all levers of power, economic and military and political. So on the right is a picture of me with Jose Chipenda, who was the General Secretary of the All African Council of Churches. He's an Angolan from our partner church, the Evangelical Church of Angola. He came to visit us, and this just kind of demonstrates how whites and blacks live together and work together at these mission stations, which itself was contrary to what the white minority regime was teaching. They were teaching basically apartheid, segregation forever. And yet at all of these missions throughout Zimbabwe, all the denominations, whites and blacks from all kinds of countries and Indians, we had a lot of Indian Christians who were there too. We lived and worked together for a common purpose successfully, which is a way of saying the dominant philosophy of the country is a lie, And the students knew that. And so that's why the American missionaries were tossed. In 1965, in 1988, I was one of the first American missionaries to be readmitted to the country after independence.
How long did it take for the Americans to be allowed to come back?
It was from 1965 till 1988, after independence, 8 years after independence. So again, it's a complicated picture, and I mentioned this last week, that in India, everywhere you go in India, people aren't interested in the religion of Christianity, but they love the hospitals and the schools that the church established. Do you know these cool cats? We have Sojourner Truth.
Sojourner Truth, very good, yes.
Which one?
Sojourner Truth.
Who's the first one on the left?
Sojourner Truth.
Next to Martin Luther King, is that Dorothy Day?
Yes, it's Dorothy Day. Ding, ding, ding.
Wow.
Kathy, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement.
Yeah.
Hi, Verna, welcome.
Hello.
Next to her is Florence Nightingale,
Oh my gosh.
nurse.
There's a lot of, it's, okay, I see one.
Mhm. Oscar Romero, martyr. Albert Schweitzer,
That's
who
right.
gave
Yeah.
his life and heart and mind to the people of Africa. And Cesar Chavez, who was, a lot of people don't realize he was really motivated by his faith. He had a Gandhian, Kingian approach to nonviolent, to changing society through nonviolence. Every day he got up, he had mass and prayed. He really saw his life as a prayer, as a gift to God. It's important to remember that in Christian history, and there have been some social movements and experiments that have been principally guided by faith. And Calvin and Luther were similar in a lot of ways, but different in a lot of ways. Luther really believed in separation, a radical theoretical separation of church and state, that the kingdom of the world is never to be mixed with the kingdom of heaven. There are two kingdoms, he said. Let's let God take care of the kingdom of the world by appointing presidents and princes and queens and kings, and giving a relative kind of social peace in the social order. Calvin said, no, if we have a voice, if we have ability, to take the gospel into the public realm, then why not? To not act is to act. So Calvin established essentially a church-based government in Geneva, Switzerland, not Illinois. That same Puritan theology, philosophy carried over into the New World, where Massachusetts was founded as a Bible Commonwealth, where the early founders, the Puritans there in Salem, and Cambridge, and Plymouth, said, let's create a city on a hill. Let's let our new world here be a bright light for the whole world. What rules shall we follow? Well, the Bible. It was kind of a naive, but also somewhat oppressive view, right? Inevitably, what do you do with people who do not see the world the way you do?
They're witches.
We call them witches and we know what to do with witches. Nonetheless, for Presbyterian and Congregational churches, we really follow Calvin more in this regard than we do Luther. And Calvin, the sense of speaking into the public square is very much a Calvinist view. All throughout American history, Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant, have spoken into the public square, used their collective voice to attempt to make a difference, to witness to the love of God in Jesus. And a little known chapter in that story is Congregational Dissent against the War of 1812. I don't have time to go into that. I've got a booklet at home. If you'd like to look at that.
Andy wants to go back again.
Thank you.
So against the US side, against,
Well,
wow, okay, well, it's a long
four
story.
pieces. It is a long
Four
story.
piece,
It's a
okay.
long story, but it's a small booklet.
Okay. Wow.
This is a better known story. Churches were key. Churches in the North, be frank about it. Churches in the North were key to addressing slavery and naming it as a moral evil, establishing the Underground Railroad, and also pressuring all levels of government and business to end cooperation with the evil of slavery. Slavery was viewed as not just a personal sin, but a social sin. So it wasn't just those who hold slaves who were morally culpable. It's all of society if we allow it together. We are all responsible then for the evil of slavery. And that drumbeat continued, of course, up to the Civil War and in the war. The church played a very important role in the establishment of this wild idea of a 40 or 50-hour work week, the abolition of child labor, the establishment of labor unions, and this radical idea of collective bargaining, and government programs, Social Security, and so on. Other social reforms, I think you can probably name them from these photos.
Lips that touch liquor shall not touch. That was famous.
The establishment of public schools has a very interesting relationship with Protestant churches, especially the Congregational Church in New England, but also Presbyterians. Horace Bushnell, a congregational minister in Hartford, was one of the key players in the establishment of public education. Public education didn't always exist in the United States. And it was churches who said, we would be a better people. The world would be a better place. Our families would be stronger if children learned their ABCs, even if they didn't have the money to pay school fees. So the idea of free public education.
Could I interject something there?
Yes, please, Lucy.
The Lutheran Church in Pennsylvania divided on that issue, which is why we have the Missouri Synod Lutherans who believed in church controlled education for children, and the Pennsylvania Ministerium, in other words, in which I now knew when I became a DRE in the 50s, with the ULC, was the group that said no, public education. And hence that was the name, Pennsylvania Ministerium.
Yeah.
So
So,
the core of the United Lutheran Church, which eventually merged with the Swedes and the Finns and the whole bunch,
so the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church has had church schools.
always. And that was the thing
Congregationalists,
that-
Presbyterians, Methodists, not. Why?
and
Because we
Lutherans-
said, let's put our energy, our time, our taxes into public schools on behalf of the society. And we'll have Sunday school
Right,
to deal with religious issues. So there's Sunday school and then there's Monday through Friday school.
other Lutheran churches too went public.
Mhm. Let's remember the Bekannte Kirche, Confessing Church in Germany, the Church of Bonhoeffer, of Martin Niemöller, who were basically committing suicide when they said, we worship God, not Hitler. Here are some other ways that the church throughout the world has spoken up against social evil. We have apartheid in South Africa, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the upper right-hand corner. And the churches continue to be a significant voice in calling all the world's governments and businesses to account on climate change. At COP26, the recently completed global multilateral governmental conversation about climate change, there was a church presence. There were many churches present among all the other non-governmental actors, trying to influence the delegates to take, not only say they're going to take action, but actually fulfill their promises. Every war that happens, it seems that the church is a place you can depend on for a contrary voice, which doesn't say that every church opposes every war that comes along, but often in churches you find people questioning, isn't there a better way? Is war needed right now? Witnessing again to the nonviolent ways of Jesus. A lot of churches in North America were kind of split by their clergy's stands on the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, early 70s. Clergy who dared to question the war, not just oppose it, but just question it, were often taken to task by their more conservative members who believed that the church should always, when the nation's at war, the church needs to stand behind the nation. That was a debate within the Vietnam War, generally in the United States, right? Can we be divided as a nation and succeed at
Are
war?
they having like a Vietnam War in Ukraine? Is it about the same thing similar?
Well, it's war,
Okay.
and the best example of church-based social justice work is, of course, the civil rights movement, which was basically based in the church, not just the Black church in the South, but in the churches of the North. And again, churches in the North, a lot of people said, well, why should that be our concern? We don't have that problem here. And clergy often said, no, what affects one person affects all of us. And this is our country. We need to speak into and act into the public square to witness to the way of Jesus Christ. And again, a lot of clergy had trouble keeping their jobs in the 50s and 60s, maybe even in the 70s, around issues of civil rights. Other ways that the church responds to God's call. And there are many more than these, right? I put rummage in here. Rummage is a great way to recycle, reuse, reduce, provide quality goods to people.
There should be
with
another
less
word.
income.
There should be another word for that.
Rummage doesn't sound
No.
appealing.
But everybody knows what it means.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know what word we'd use. Also like to mention here, occurred to me this morning, a lot of our colleges and universities today got their start as church-based. It's named something.
Northwestern
Northwestern.
University. That's right.
Michigan State,
Many
Michigan State?
public schools.
Michigan State.
No, we're church-related,
Church.
church-related,
oh,
That was.
Notre Dame.
yeah,
Yeah.
Notre Dame. A lot of our small liberal arts
Mark
colleges, yeah, well, what about our hospital systems in Chicago? Which of them are church-based?
Lots.
Advocate.
Advocate Aurora and Ascension is Roman Catholic.
Well, I always wondered if a woman's having a baby in a Catholic hospital, something goes wrong. I was wondering, never mind, but any
No,
further. but-
No, there can be. This is one way that being a church-related institution might influence
Yeah,
your care.
Yeah, you know,
Absolutely.
Rush was always Rush Presbyterian at St. Luke's.
Amita Health is Seventh-day Adventist. Some of these ministries may be described as ministries of charity, which is again ministering more to the downstream wounds of social victims. And others may be understood as ministries of justice, which is kind of the upstream, higher level systemic structural work to change society in such a way that there are fewer victims downstream. So examples are homeless shelters, might be described as ministries of charity, and demonstrations for legislation to provide for more public housing or more adequate Section 8 housing might be described as ministries of justice. If there's more affordable housing, there might be fewer homeless people in shelters. And this is not to say that one of these two is better than the other, only to say that they're both needed, they're both related, and that the church has always been involved in both. Okay, theology now. Someone said a few weeks ago that, well, if we all just love one another, that's what it's all about. Love is a wonderful word. We use it a lot in the church. It's also an imprecise word. When the church, though, says love, it's referring to the Greek word in particular, agape, which is not feeling, although feelings can be involved. It's not romance. It's work. It's action. Love and action is agape. And action includes sacrifice, effort, cost, risk. So, have you heard of this word agape before?
Yes.
yeah,
Probably, yeah.
There's at least, I think in Greek, at least 4 different words.
Yes,
So there's love of your significant other, love
Yes.
of your siblings.
right.
There's at least a few others.
And eros.
Eros, yes, the erotic love.
Yeah.
I've heard it defined as love is something you do.
That's so simple and beautiful.
nice.
I'm recycling some slides from our previous series on sort of looking at Christianity as a fresh start as adults. When Jesus is a white guy, it sort of sets our theology off in a certain direction that benefits probably people who do not need further benefiting. When Jesus is imagined as really who he was, someone who lived on the margins of society, growing up in Nazareth, under the oppression of both the temple elite and ultimately the Romans. When Jesus is envisioned as a non-white, maybe even non-male figure, which is hard to do since he was a boy. But at least imagining Jesus as indigenous, which we talked about back in October, I think. Jesus is Black, disabled, which we talked about 2 or 3 years ago. Somebody came here and talked about her book, picturing Jesus as disabled, that Jesus is both wounded and alive. I don't know if you remember Nancy Iceland. Jesus is queer, gender non-conforming. Jesus was very tender. Jesus was very caring. Jesus seemed to bend gender in some ways. Jesus is poor, that does not require a lot of imagination. Jesus as a refugee in the story in Matthew, when Jesus and his family are spirited off into Egypt, running away from Herod. So if Jesus is all those things, then Jesus is an outcast himself, then the ministry of the church is reasonably understood as being skewed also to the outcast, to the marginalized, and those whom Howard Thurman called the disinherited. A lot of people think the church is here to preserve and promote the church. This may be the problem of growing a church. People don't want to join a church just to be part of an institution, maybe, and to further the institution itself. The church doesn't exist for itself. How's that? That's a radical comment. The church exists for the sake of the world. I've even heard it said that the church is the only organization in the world that does not exist for the sake of its members, but for the sake of its non-members. That's a more radical statement. It's provocative, at least.
I wish all the churches would believe that.
Well, it starts with us. It starts with us, setting an example. Recycling these slides again from last fall, the social gospel was a great example of how Christians came together to understand the ills of society as sin. Walter Rauschenbusch was a great exemplar of that. We talked around Christmas time about how Jesus uses the privilege of being divine to become unprivileged and work on behalf of those who do not share in all the benefits of society. This is in Philippians 4, but it's a great Christmas passage. Philippians 2, sorry. The idea that Jesus gives up his privileges so that others can enjoy privilege of life. In other words, Jesus comes to walk with us in our struggles, not just spiritual struggles, but all of our struggles. We talked about liberation theology last fall. Again, a way of saying that salvation is not when you die and go to heaven. Salvation is both spiritual and material. We also talked about the cross, and that this is an example of how love is always costly. Bonhoeffer talked about grace that way. Grace is not cheap, he says. Cheap grace is not real grace. Grace has a response, the response of love. We also talked about the Trinity, an understanding of God as community, God as one and many simultaneously. Suggesting that the church's work then is always community-based. It's about community, by the community, for the community. Last thing I'll say here before we go to today's question, which we have good time for, is it seems to me shockingly encouraging that despite the many reasons why Jesus' message might have been diluted in these last 2,000 years. By diluted, I mean co-opted by the state or the powers that be, or so spiritualized that it's just about when you die and go to heaven. So we know those elements exist within Christianity in the last 2,000 years, right? What's shockingly encouraging to me is that Jesus' subversive message is still there. And we're talking about it today. And all these theologians and Christians have heard that just through all the other noise of Christianity. They still understood Jesus to be provocative, to be questioning the status quo, and always pointing to a better way, a better way, a better way. And questioning people with privilege and saying, if I gave up, Jesus says, I gave up my privilege so that others may live. What are you doing with your privilege? Whether that's male privilege or American privilege, white privilege, or straight privilege, or able-bodied privilege, whatever your privilege is, why are you holding on to it rather than investing it for a better world? That message of Jesus is still present. It's still dangerous for preachers to preach it. But if the gospel doesn't have an edge to it, I'm not sure it's the gospel. So, with all of that, how does our framing question appear to you?
Speak out, that's what he's calling us to.
Speak out.
To share love, that God is love, and to share Christianity, just to let you know that God loves you, and He never leave you or forsake you.
Thank you, Verna. I began this particular PowerPoint with this quote from Bonhoeffer, so I end with it. The church still has a voice. It has money, it has people, it has property. In a country like the United States, where I think we can still speak openly, we have democratic abilities. We can speak, we can act as individuals, as a group. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. Any other reflections on this particular PowerPoint, direction, church history, theology? Here's the framing question, which I know you can't see now. Can you see the question?
Yes.
So there's an A part. What are today's most urgent needs in our country, community, and region? Get as local as you can on the A part. The B part, broaden it out as far as you can go. Okay, friends, so let's talk about those questions. Take this either way. Where's God already at work in our locality and in the world? And what are the urgent needs in our and beyond? Let's start first with our community.
Well, I think we can start with all the things that the church is already, this church is already doing, right? It's involved in everyone from helping out with the kitchen down at the north side, the things that Rummage does. It's no longer involved, but we started, of course, the child care remains a need. And the various charity side, all the various charities that we contribute money to. And the church is open, so many different things. People that are non-members come here for human services and other things like that. So, I think let's not forget all the things that the church does, and there must be other things that I'm forgetting.
It's a great start.
It's important to think, not only are we doing those things, but maybe how can we do them better? How can we do them more expansively? How can we make a greater impact there?
To what extent is the church still involved or friendly with Women's Exchange, which was founded? In fact, I was on the committee of 6 that gathered together in the living room, put it together, and I named it. But I'm wondering how the organization and its many interesting programs. I mean, are still affiliated with church. Does anybody know? Because I no longer attend them. We often know county.
Before we launch into that, I'd like to tell a little story about one of our university presidents. When we would go to the president and ask for resources to do something, which is kind of where this conversation is going, he'd always say, well, how much skin do you have in this game? If you want $100 from me, you got to put 25 in, and maybe I'll give you 50. So it would be helpful when we go around the room, when we identify these things we'd like to do. What are we already doing as individuals? Because I think that would help focus more on where we already think there are needs, and we are already employing our resources to change them.
Or speaking as a church, you know, if we see there's a need in our community, well, what is WCC doing now?
But what am I doing individually? Because then I've already committed myself to this, and I'm not asking someone else to commit themselves without me doing anything. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that
So I think there's like, that can look like a variety of things. It could be financial, it could be time, it could be commitment.
Anything that you
intellectually,
do personally
Yeah.
is a leading indicator of where you've already made a decision. There's another way of describing this. When our researchers in transportation in Northwestern University create questionnaires to find out how to plan for the future, they've come to realize that there are stated preferences and revealed preferences, which are different. So I'd like to work on the revealed preferences as opposed to the stated preferences. And I'm sorry to take up so much time with this, but it's a
I
subtle.
think it's a good point. It's well understood, well stated. There may be some things that we're missing though, around needs in the community,
No,
if we're only looking at the things that we're already doing.
Well,
well, I agree, but yeah,
but we should identify them at least, start with that. and
Know
then
where we
can-
are first, and then from that we can define what we're not doing.
Right.
And look farther.
So one thing that, sorry, if thinking about it on the flip side, identifying what they are and then what we're actually doing where there's a discrepancy, or how we might rise to the occasion.
Right, there's obviously a lot more from the charity side and the justice side. Tons more we could be doing.
Oh, yeah.
Where do we prioritize the next greater good?
I think enthusiasm, it plays a huge part, people's motivation. But I wanted to stress the word community, church. Our official name is the Winnetka Community Church. Congregational church, and I wanted to have the word community because when I first moved to Winnetka in 1969, all I was impressed with was Winnetka as a village and the Winnetka Community Church. That's how I think of it.
It should be blended. Just across the street, since the community house's beginning was run by us.
Yes, of course, and I mean, we gave it to the
Built by
village.
us.
That's right.
Legally, we're trying to separate ourselves.
Right, and the fact that our church gave that to the village, I was so impressed.
Yeah.
They didn't do that in Glenview, which is where I came from.
George Brodsky's book about this congregation details how there was talk about changing the name of the church. Dropping congregational. One thing is it's not pronounceable. Congressional, concentrational.
You are.
But also to reflect the nature of being a community church. And not just aspirational, but descriptive, because so many members actually came from so many different backgrounds.
Right.
So read George's book. It's hard to change an institution's name. So they came back to.
And one more thing I must say is in those days, they had community, people from all of Chicago, and of course there was this impetus with political, what was going on in the city with labor and so on, but people came from all over to praise, you know, this beautiful town. They'd meet over in the woods, where we have a building that I think it's the Maple Street people just came and talked. Of course, we don't do that now. We watch television or whatever, but I think we could play. I mean, we've had so many wonderful things in the sanctuary where people from all over, this place was filled when book reviews and so on came. We don't do that anymore.
We have one coming up.
Tuesday night.
Tuesday night,
Well,
Well,
right?
that's true.
Ken Schakowsky-
But
Yeah.
but they're held in the basement and they're a small fraction of what used to go on up here in the
No,
sanctuary.
we're doing it in the sanctuary.
But I do
And-
Well, we'll
remember,
see, we'll see, Chuck, how many.
COVID has cut this
People
out.
aren't aware
Of
of it.
course,
Nancy,
but
COVID for the last several years has
Yeah.
wiped everything out as far as a meeting is concerned. Before that, and not that recently ago, I remember a pretty full sanctuary here when the book bin had important people coming to speak. Like
That's true,
Madeline
that's what I was
Albright.
Making
thinking.
it more
Yes,
space,
and
yeah.
that
That's
was
right.
not that long ago. I
we
mean,
can all
so-
remember, this is,
Sure.
I mean, as a society, and maybe
Yeah.
our, local issues and global national issues are basically one and the same when you get down to it, but you're making me think of a book that came out 10 years ago called Bowling Alone. I really recommend it. Since World War II, we've splintered. People used to have bowling leagues and Cub Scout troops, and people would gather around a certain purpose and would bring people together, and they would understand their neighbors more. We're not doing that as much anymore. And maybe if we could revive that as best we could in this community of ours for Congregationalists and non-Congregationalists, we would just be face to face and understand each other more.
So
Be more
community fracturing, community, not divisions, but just
Yes.
not coming together.
That's right. And we'd be able to talk to people who
And I
would
think
agree with us.
sometimes we assume that something is gonna go on forever without being intentional about giving it energy and resources it needs, and I'm thinking in particular of Rummage.
Yeah, Rummage is on
It's
a
founder.
danger list.
And for,
And I don't think the church even understands that, because I know Jane Hughes has come twice to the council meetings and has said this. I've detected no reaction whatsoever.
and when you think of all the good that goes on
It's hard to get people.
at so many levels, and I'm thinking in particular of within individual departments, the communities of workers that come from non-church, their non-church lives to give because they realize that it's taking goods, putting it in the hands of people who can use it, taking the money, putting it to good things.
Well, and employ people who need the money for jobs. We give
And-
their jobs that we hire and fill.
to talk about that and say, this is in danger and we need some good leadership. We need
guts too. I'm sorry to use the word.
We need the young people coming up.
Enthusiasm.
I'm one of those that work in Rummage like crazy. I was in charge of toys for a while. Think about that.
Yeah.
But physically, I'm 95. I physically cannot lift boxes this big anymore.
What?
No, so the point being, how is, and this is part of the church's ministry, what are we doing on the teenage and 20s and 30s age level to invest them with the need to pitch in? That's the problem.
There's also the problem of politics with the community house and the Winnetka Congregational Church. That's what I meant by guts. There's big problems that go on, struggling because
Aren't they
They
getting
want-
together the way they would?
they want all the rooms for
Oh, yeah,
programs.
Yeah.
And we have no place to store anything, so.
I think what I'm hearing at the most basic local level here is two things. One is civil discourse and one is relationships. And that goes back a little bit to what we were talking about previously. God is about being, church is about being in relationship.
Wow.
Exactly.
So if there's something beyond what we're doing now, which of course I raised, I just wonder what we can do with affordable housing in the local community. This Chuck has been involved in that in the past. And
What was this, the community
it's
organization?
Extremely
across
challenging.
the streets.
Pardon?
There's a community of housing policy organization just across the street. And it's not there anymore. The building's been torn down. It was renting that beautiful
Oh,
wooden
yeah.
house from the
that
community
was
house.
the,
What was that called?
that was the house with Junior League House. It's where the
Yeah,
junior
but there's
league-
a 501c3
Yeah.
about housing
Right,
issues.
The lady who ran that is no longer here.
Yeah, well, they're based in Edmonton
Schecter,
now.
Gail Schecter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Gail
yeah.
Spector.
Gail Schechter.
Schechter.
That's
Yeah.
right, yes, thank you. Mhm.
And Gail's
Fair housing.
organization
Was it
still
called Fair
exists.
Housing?
Yes, exactly. She's doing a
Yeah,
lot
it
of
was-
things in Rogers Park or
Is she
something.
still
That's-
alive?
Oh, no, here.
Oh, really?
Is she still
Gail
on?
Gail
Yeah, she
Schechter's
is.
organization still exists.
Right.
And I can get you her, is it?
I've known her.
Her
She
website.
introduced me to this church,
By
actually.
the way, that's a very steep, tall mountain in this town.
We know.
There was a
Yeah.
huge.
Kind of ironic that it would be based here.
WOA created, and I mean, it was, there are people who
Oh, yeah.
got battle scars from this
Oh,
church
yeah.
over this.
They're good. The
So
architects and builders.
that means there's juice in it, right?
Yeah,
Well,
Oh, yeah.
it's- Well,
If
if you,
it's-
if you want to take this on, you're gonna need a lot of body armor. And I mean a lot.
Well,
So keep that in mind. So I heard affordable housing as an unmet need in our community and all the other good things that were brought up.
The first thing we talked about locally was climate change, affordable housing, dealing with COVID, going back to family promise, which we don't do anymore. We wish we did. Getting rid of red lines, redlining and increasing integration in housing. And then in the nation, in the world, obviously climate. Oh, we talked about our region too, gun violence, education, poverty, food, and a lot of that can be national, I suspect. Seeing one another as equals. Climate change again. We didn't get into much detail, but we did talk briefly about refugees and about voting rights and access to choice for women.
We began talking about issues we were interested in, somewhat similar to you, and then we also put a lens. We also quickly zeroed down to our own specific church and some of the things that this particular church had been called to do locally. We focused on the community house and then some other issues connected with our role in the community, including rummage. And one of the benefits of our church historically has been bringing people in the community, whether they're members or not, into the church for discussions or events. And in terms of rummage, the value that it has is of bringing people together for a common cause. How can we help to continue that important role at a time when culturally we're losing many of the things that typically brought us together? I would add largely due to sports that children are involved in. That's my personal note. And restoring or introducing a commitment, especially for younger generations, I heard, of getting involved and being active. And what it seemed to me was, one, as I was listening, was the role of church, again, at the most basic local level is how can we work towards improving and facilitating civil discourse and building relationships, and from that foundational groundwork towards moving out towards action.